November 20th, 1975, BBC Television Theatre, London. 8 million viewers tuned in to Top of the Pops expecting a typical music show, but what they witnessed instead became the most shocking moment in British television history. When Professor Malcolm Hartley, Britain's most feared music critic, looked directly at Freddie Mercury and challenged him to sing Puccini's Nessun Dorma on live television. Nobody knew they were about to witness a performance that would force one of the most arrogant men in classical music to publicly resign in shame the very next day. Because Freddie Mercury had been hiding a secret that would leave every opera snob speechless and prove once and for all that true genius cannot be confined by the narrow prejudices of bitter old men. Professor Malcolm Hartley wasn't just any critic. He held the prestigious chair of musicology at Cambridge University, a position he'd occupied for 18 distinguished years. He'd been trained at the Royal Academy of Music, where he graduated summa cum laude in 1954 and served as the chief classical music correspondent for The Guardian. His office walls were lined with photographs of himself alongside Pavarotti, Sutherland, and other operatic legends who sought his approval. He considered himself a guardian of real music, which to him meant classical opera and chamber music performed by serious musicians in serious venues with proper training and cultural pedigree. He saw rock and roll as cultural vandalism, a degradation of British musical heritage, and Freddie Mercury as the disease's most flamboyant and dangerous symptom. Professor Hartley's crusade against Queen had begun in 1973 when he'd first heard Keep Yourself Alive on Radio 1. The combination of operatic pretensions with electric guitars had offended him so deeply that he'd written an unprompted letter to The Guardian calling it musical sacrilege. Since then, he had written multiple columns about Queen, each more scathing than the last. He called Freddie a preening peacock masquerading as a musician, insulting opera with his theatrical vulgarity. He said Queen's music was theatrical noise designed to distract from the complete absence of artistic substance or cultural understanding. He wrote that Freddie Mercury represented everything wrong with modern Britain: style over substance, volume over artistry, spectacle over soul, and worst of all, immigrant pretension masquerading as British culture. These weren't just reviews. They were personal attacks dripping with academic contempt, class prejudice, and barely concealed xenophobia. To Professor Hartley, rock music wasn't just inferior. It was the enemy of civilization itself, and Freddie Mercury was leading the barbarian charge. The producers of Top of the Pops knew about Professor Hartley's crusade against Queen. That's why they invited him as a special guest on the same episode where Queen was scheduled to perform their new single Bohemian Rhapsody in November 1975. It was a ratings masterstroke. Queen was Britain's most controversial band with their operatic pretensions and Freddie's theatrical excess. Having their most distinguished critic there would create tension, intellectual debate, and most importantly, viewers. What the BBC producers didn't know was that Professor Hartley had a plan. He wasn't just going to sit in the panel and offer polite commentary after Queen's performance. He was going to expose Freddie Mercury as a fraud on live television in front of 8 million Britons. The show started normally enough. Top of the Pops presenter David Jensen introduced the acts, played some records, and then announced Queen. The BBC television theater, with its Art Deco interior and distinctive curved balcony, erupted as Freddie strode to the microphone in his white vest, his distinctive overbite flashing in a confident smile. The studio's professional lighting caught the sequins on his costume, creating an almost ethereal glow around him. Behind him, Brian May's red special guitar gleamed under the television lights, while Roger Taylor positioned himself behind his distinctive clear drum kit. John Deacon stood quietly with his bass, the calm anchor in Queen's visual storm. Queen launched into Bohemian Rhapsody, their ambitious 6-minute opus that had been dismissed by many as uncommercial madness. But as Freddie's voice soared from tender ballad to operatic crescendo to hard rock finale, the studio audience was mesmerized. His vocal range was extraordinary, sliding effortlessly from the gentle "Mama just killed a man" to the thunderous "So you think you can stone me and spit in my eye?" with a precision that made even the BBC's seasoned sound engineers pause in admiration. This wasn't just pop music. This was something unprecedented, ambitious, almost classical in its scope and complexity, yet undeniably rooted in rock's rebellious energy. When Queen finished, the applause was thunderous. Freddie remained at the microphone, catching his breath, basking in the moment. His left hand unconsciously moved to his chest, feeling his heart still racing from the adrenaline of performance. This was their moment. Bohemian Rhapsody was about to change everything for Queen, and Freddie could feel it. That's when Professor Hartley struck. "Mr. Mercury," came a crisp, authoritative voice from the panel area. Freddie looked over to see a distinguished man in an expensive suit rising from his chair. "Since you're still at that microphone, perhaps you'd care to demonstrate whether you can actually sing, not just perform." The studio fell silent. This wasn't the usual Top of the Pops banter. Freddie felt his heart skip a beat, his hand instinctively pressing against his chest. "I beg your pardon," he replied, trying to keep his voice steady. David Jensen quickly introduced Professor Hartley as one of Britain's most distinguished music scholars and asked what he thought of Queen's performance. Professor Hartley didn't hold back. "What I witnessed wasn't music, Mr. Jensen. It was theatrical marketing. Mr. Mercury can certainly pose and prance about. Teenage girls certainly scream. But let's be honest about what this is. It's not artistry. It's not musicianship. It's spectacle designed to distract from a fundamental lack of actual vocal ability." The studio audience murmured uncomfortably. This wasn't the celebratory atmosphere they were used to on Top of the Pops. This was an academic assault. Freddie remained at the microphone, his jaw tight, his hands still pressed against his racing heart. He'd been ambushed on live television. "You want to know the difference between a real vocalist and Mr. Mercury?" Professor Hartley continued, his voice carrying the authority of Cambridge lecture halls. "A real vocalist has classical training, has technique, can read music, can perform the great works of musical literature. Mr. Mercury can wiggle his hips to a backbeat. Those are not the same thing." Professor David Jensen interjected, trying to diffuse the tension. "Surely Queen's music has its own artistic merit." "Does it?" Professor Hartley interrupted. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out several sheets of paper. "This is Nessun Dorma from Puccini's Turandot. It's one of the greatest tenor arias ever written, composed in 1924. It requires perfect breath control, 4-octave range, flawless technique, and deep understanding of classical composition. It's the kind of piece that separates real singers from pop performers." He held up the sheet music like a weapon. "If you're truly a vocalist, Mr. Mercury, and not just a good-looking young man in costume who got lucky, you should be able to perform this right now on this stage for Britain." The audience gasped. This was an ambush, and everyone knew it. David Jensen looked at his producers in the wings, unsure how to handle this. This wasn't in the script, but they were live and there was nothing they could do. 8 million people were watching at home, and tension like this was television gold. Freddie looked at the sheet music from across the studio, his heart pounding so hard he could feel it against his palm. The camera zoomed in on him, and millions of Britons held their breath. This was either going to be the most humiliating moment in British television history or something else entirely. "You want me to sing Nessun Dorma right now?" Freddie asked, his voice quiet but carrying clearly through the studio sound system. "If you can," Professor Hartley said with academic smugness. "But I understand if you can't. Not everyone has real training. There's no shame in admitting that you're just a performer, not a musician." What Professor Hartley didn't know, what almost nobody knew, was that Freddie Mercury had been obsessed with opera since childhood. Not just as a fan, but as a devoted student. Growing up as Farrokh Bulsara in Zanzibar and later India, he had discovered Maria Callas when he was 8 years old. Her voice had captivated him so completely that he spent every penny of his pocket money on opera recordings. He would listen to La Traviata, Tosca, and Turandot until he knew every note, every phrase, every emotional nuance. But it wasn't just appreciation. Freddie's father, Bomi Bulsara, came from an ancient Persian family with deep musical traditions. Zoroastrian prayer singing had been passed down through generations of Bulsaras, techniques for breath control and vocal projection that were older than European opera itself. Bomi had quietly taught his son these methods, never imagining they would serve him on a British television stage decades later. And there was something else, something Freddie had always been self-conscious about. His pronounced overbite, the dental irregularity that made him cover his mouth when he smiled, actually created a unique resonance chamber in his mouth. What he saw as a flaw was actually a gift. His unusual dental structure allowed him to achieve vocal effects that conventionally perfect singers couldn't match. Freddie never talked about his operatic training because it didn't fit Queen's image. Rock and roll was supposed to be rebellious, instinctive, raw. Admitting he had studied classical technique would make him seem calculated, manufactured. But standing there in the BBC television theater with Professor Hartley's condescension burning into him and 8 million people waiting to see him fail, Freddie made a decision. He was going to show them what he could really do. "I'll sing it," Freddie said, his hands still pressed against his chest, feeling his heart hammering against his ribs. "But I'll need the orchestra to follow my interpretation." David Jensen, sensing this might become legendary television, quickly signaled to the BBC orchestra. The musical director, a seasoned professional named Richard Thompson, looked at the sheet music and then at Freddie with concern. "Mr. Mercury, Nessun Dorma, is extraordinarily difficult. Even trained opera singers prepare for months before attempting it. Are you certain you want to try this?" "Yes," Freddie said simply, his voice steady despite the chaos in his chest. The studio audience was completely silent. You could feel the tension radiating through the BBC television theater. Professor Hartley sat back down, arms crossed, that academic smirk still on his face. He was about to watch his nemesis crash and burn on live television. This was going to be the vindication he'd been waiting for. The moment when Britain would finally see through the theatrical nonsense and recognize Queen for what they really were, posers masquerading as musicians. Freddie stepped closer to the microphone. He closed his eyes for a moment, and when he opened them, something had changed. The flamboyant rock star persona was gone. In its place was someone else, someone most of Britain had never seen. A serious artist about to attempt something that could destroy his career if he failed. Richard Thompson counted off, and the BBC orchestra began the haunting introduction to Nessun Dorma. It's one of the most beautiful and unforgiving pieces in the operatic repertoire. The melody soars and dives, demanding incredible breath control and perfect pitch. The lyrics are in Italian, requiring precise pronunciation. It's the kind of aria that reveals instantly whether someone is a real singer or just pretending to be one. In the first few bars, Freddie began to sing, and the studio went completely silent. Not the polite silence of people watching a performance, but the stunned silence of people witnessing something they never expected to hear. His voice was completely different from his Queen performances. This wasn't the Freddie who sang Killer Queen or Now I'm Here. This was a voice that had been trained, refined, developed through years of secret study. His breath control was perfect, his support flawless. His pronunciation of the Italian lyrics was not just accurate, but emotionally authentic, carrying the weight of genuine understanding. But more than the technical perfection, there was soul. He wasn't just hitting the notes correctly. He was making them live, making them speak. The Persian vocal techniques his father had taught him added ornaments and emotional colors that European opera singers couldn't achieve. His unusual dental structure created resonances that made the aria sound both familiar and completely new. The camera caught Professor Hartley's face. The smirk was gone. His mouth was slightly open, his eyes wide with disbelief. He looked like a man watching his entire worldview collapse in real time. As Freddie approached the climactic phrase Vincero, his left hand pressed harder against his chest, not from vocal strain, but from overwhelming emotion. He held that high B-flat, pure and strong and beautiful, for what seemed like forever. When he finally released the note, there were tears visible on his face, not from exhaustion, but from vindication. When Freddie sang the final Vincero, the note hung in the air like a declaration of war against prejudice itself. There was absolute silence for 3 seconds. Then the studio audience erupted. People were on their feet, screaming, crying, applauding wildly. The BBC orchestra members were standing and clapping, their instruments forgotten. Richard Thompson had set down his baton and was applauding with tears streaming down his face. The sound was deafening. It was recognition, the sound of barriers crumbling, of minds changing in real time. David Jensen stood up, his mouth open in amazement. Ladies and gentlemen, I think we just witnessed television history. The camera found Professor Hartley. He wasn't applauding. He was just sitting there, his face pale, staring at Freddie like he was seeing him for the first time. David Jensen walked over to him. Well, Professor Hartley, what do you think now? Professor Hartley's voice was barely audible. I was wrong. He walked across the studio to where Freddie stood. Mr. Mercury, I owe you a profound public apology. I thought I knew what music was, but I was just a snob with credentials, protecting my own narrow world. He extended his hand. You're one of the finest operatic voices I have ever heard. I am deeply ashamed of every word I have written about you. Freddie shook his hand. Thank you, sir. That means more than you know. By the next morning, every newspaper in Britain was talking about it. The BBC received more calls about that single performance than any other moment in Top of the Pops history. Professor Hartley resigned from The Guardian 3 days later. His resignation letter became legendary. Last night, Freddie Mercury taught me that genius doesn't recognize genre boundaries. I cannot recognize greatness when it stands before me. Freddie never talked much about that performance, but people close to Queen said it was one of the moments he was most proud of. Balmy Bulsara was watching from his home in Feltham that night. When Freddie's voice soared through those passages, Balmy remembered teaching his young son the ancient Zoroastrian songs decades earlier. Breathe from here, he had taught little Farouk. This is how our people have sung for 1,000 years. The performance challenged the cultural snobbery that said rock and classical music existed in different worlds. It proved someone could be both a theatrical rock god and a classically trained vocalist. The real legacy was simple. A young Parsi immigrant who had been told rock music wasn't serious art stood on British television and proved that prejudice is no match for preparation, that talent refuses to be categorized. Nessun Dorma means none shall sleep. And on that night in 1975, Freddie Mercury's voice was so powerful, so unexpected, so triumphant that even his biggest critic couldn't close his eyes to the greatness he had been blind to all along.